Well, welcome all. It's great to see you here. I'm Jessica Matthews, president of the Endowment. And it's a great pleasure to host this event, which marks the publication of another Tom Crothers study in a very long stretch of them, written with Saskia Breckenmacher from our Brussels Center, entitled Closing Space, Democracy and Human Rights Under Fire. It seems to have been more timely than we might have hoped for. But the study looks at the rising pressures that governments in many places are exerting against democracy support, against civil society, and especially against civil society aid that comes from outside their countries. And for some foreign leaders who are facing public unrest, and that's a number that is obviously increasing in these post-Arab awakening days, civil society has become a code word for foreign conspiracies designed to overthrow them. And we hear this not just from President Putin most recently about Ukraine, but from leaders in South America, the Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere. In the past 5 years, a sort of an alarming number of governments have either seriously considered or actually passed into law restrictions against foreign funding for civil society, usually as part of broader campaigns against NGOs and other civic groups. And this phenomenon obviously poses a serious challenge to the United States, to Europe, and to other international actors who want to help foster stronger civil society and democracy and human rights generally. I think the situation should be seen as part of a very changed international context. We're obviously living in a period of diffusion of power in the world in which there's less consensus on political norms than people had thought a few years ago, and many more arguments over sovereignty and the rights and wrongs of foreign intervention. This is the field that Tom Crothers has plowed so seriously for a great many years to advance understanding of democratization and in dozens of countries around the world, to study the comparative politics of political transitions and international efforts to support democratic reform. He is an expert as well on international assistance for the rule of law. And I would say that his work is known for consistent ability to forecast where the curve is headed, to identify new trends, for being creative, constructive, evidence-based, and intellectually independent. And it's a record of which Carnegie is very proud. Tom is going to present for a few minutes some of the nuggets from this new work. And then to help us think through these issues, we're really honored to have Ben Rhodes with us for the first time at the Carnegie Endowment, I think. Ben is Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications and Speechwriting. In this position, he oversees the President's National Security Communications, Speechwriting, and Public Engagement. He also chairs, and this is particularly relevant for today, an interagency committee on civil society, as many of you know, I think, and so is uniquely positioned to discuss this report and its potential impacts on U.S. policy. So, Ben, we're enormously pleased to have you in what is, I know, a frantically busy time for you, and we're very grateful. So, Tom, why don't we turn the mic to you, and then we'll hear from Mr. Rhodes.
Jessica, thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thank you all for coming. I'd like first to thank my co-author, Saskia Breckenmacher, who couldn't be here today because she's based in Brussels, but she was a true co-author at every stage of the project, and I really enjoyed working with her. We're going to be doing a launch event together in Brussels in a couple of weeks, so she is participating in some of the outreach. And there are many people in this room. I wish I could thank everyone, but this report was really an It Takes a Village project. As I look around, many people, both within the U.S. government and the non-governmental community, were fundamentally helpful at every step of the way. So thanks to all of you, and sorry I can't thank you all one by one. I won't spend too much time on the scope of the problem, particularly because I think with this group, a lot of you know what it is. I would say, just to try to get it analytically a little clearer, in a way there are two closing space problems that get a bit mixed up, although they're related to each other. One is that there's a phenomenon of closing space for civil society in the world, governments taking actions to limit the amount of space for civil society to operate within their own territory in the many ways that unfortunately we know. There's also a problem of closing space for international efforts to assist civil society, but not just to assist civil society, but also to assist political parties, or to carry out international election observing, or other elements of the democracy agenda. And these two closing space issues are related, but they're, in a sense, circles that only partially overlap. There are countries that are really going strongly against international assistance in a whole number of domains, and not just in civil society. The difference between these two circles was highlighted to me simply about half an hour ago in my office. I Googled closing space civil society, and my report is not listed. If I Google civil society democracy, it's the first thing listed. There's still in some people's mind a little bit of a confusion over what is the problem here. And I think we should see that they're related problems, closing space for civil society as a whole, and closing space for the international community that's trying to be helpful across borders on civil society and a whole number of other domains related to democracy. I know it sounds like a technical distinction, but I've found in discussions in the policy community, sometimes there are confusions. Now, what I want to go to first is, although the phenomenon is fairly well known, there are some misunderstandings that I hear from different people as I talk about the subject. The first thing that I hear is, well, this isn't really new. We've always had problems. China's never liked democracy assistance. North Korea doesn't let us do this. What's new here? This is just, a few new feathers have been ruffled, but I don't see anything new. I disagree pretty strongly with that. It's new in two different ways. First, we're losing space in countries that had accepted an international role in these kind of issues for a long time. If you go back to the 1990s and look at all the areas in which USAID and other US governmental actors were working in Russia, parliaments, judiciary, civil society, political parties, media, it's astonishing. This is about the reduction of space that was once achieved, not simply we've never gotten China to like, international action. So this is about the loss of space, not just space we never had. Secondly, it's much more extensive and more intensive than it has been before. Look at the trials in Egypt against 43 different internationals involved in Nigeria. We've never seen something like that in a US ally. So this is a level of intensivity and extensiveness, and this spans Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, South America, the former Soviet Union, and elsewhere. So it is new in that sense. It's not just what we've always had. Secondly, some people try to explain this phenomenon as it's an authoritarian resurgence in the world. That's what's happening, and that's why we have the problem. In some cases, that's true. The project in Russia to sort of close down the political order over the last, or the political space over the last 10 to 12 years is an authoritarian project, and the bad consequences for civil society and international aid are part of that. But it isn't that simple. In many countries, you're seeing a sensitivity about a foreign role that isn't part of an authoritarian project. India, for example, 4 years ago passed a new law that's rather restrictive on international participation in civil society. It's not part of some authoritarian resurgence in India. It's a special sensitivity about an international role in domestic political affairs. In Egypt, the trials came not as part of an authoritarian resurgence. Actually, Mubarak had allowed surprising amount of certain kinds of political assistance, and it was during a period of what we thought was democratic opening in Egypt that people faced a legal action against them. And so simply saying there's an authoritarian resurgence in the world and therefore we're having a problem with democracy and rights support is missing some important causal issues, and it's too simple of a concept, in some ways misleading us. The third misunderstanding is that this is really only about the United States, and it's about the U.S. geostrategic role. And a number of Europeans and sort of international organizations sometimes cling to this view and think this is really an American problem. It's not our problem. There are cases where it is an American problem in the sense that a particular leader really has a particular issue with the U.S. role in his country and is trying to block it or stop it. And so the Bolivian decision to ask USAID to leave the country not long ago was very much about the Bolivian attitude towards the United States and its role in South America. But there are many places and many organizations being affected that are not American, and this really isn't just about the United States and the government of that country. And so in the Egyptian trials, for example, we saw a German organization, the Adenauer Stiftung, caught up in that. And there are many European organizations that have been affected in many places, as well as international organizations. And so simplifying it down again to this is just an American problem misses the bigger picture. Fourth misunderstanding is some people think the leaders who are taking these kind of actions, they don't really fear this assistance. They're just doing this to whip up nationalist sentiment. But deep down, they know it isn't really that serious of an issue, the fact that some outsiders are coming and working in their societies. I think that's wrong in many cases. I think they really do believe some of the things they say that sound to us kind of outlandish about the fact that their view that we have, quote, organized revolutions in their countries. They tend to believe too much in the power of this activity and misunderstand the nature of it. First, because some of them use their own tactics of using money outside their borders, and they use it in some cases for provocation or political subversion and other things. And so they say, we know these tactics. We do them ourselves. They don't say that out loud, but they're thinking to themselves, that must be what it is because that's what's in our toolbox. They also do tend to just exaggerate the power of relatively small and I think often modest programs. It is a little bit ironic that many of the NGOs, we know in town that are doing this work, try really hard to prove to their funders that they have some impact. But abroad, they're being taken as so powerful that one, $55,000 training program was enough to do in an entire regime. And there's just an enormous mismatch between what we kind of know about the effectiveness and power of this work and how it looks when the telescope is seen, when you look through the other end of the telescope, and that's real. In addition, as citizens rise up in many countries and question their leaders, it's very hard for those leaders to accept that that's a reality without explaining it away through foreign subversion. We're seeing an increasing pattern of citizens around the world challenging the legitimacy of their leaders based on poor performance by those leaders. And leaders are having a hard time accepting that that's happening. And it's useful to believe, not just useful, but it's seductive to believe that that must be the result of someone who's stirring them up, because on their own, why would they do this? And so it's a deep explanation for them that helps make sense of a world that they feel a little bit out of control of. How have been the responses of the United States and other parts of the community? I think when this trend began to pick up momentum, the responses were a little bit slow and a little bit scattered, and we're somewhat critical in the report of some elements of that. There was a tendency to see it as a kind of a specialized problem, a technical problem. Oh, we have a problem with the NGO law in this country. We'll call Doug Rutson at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. He does amazing analyses of this, and his work is fundamental to my report. And they've got a technical team there that'll send them an analysis of this law, and then that'll fix it. Actually, the work of ICNL is fundamental and tremendously important, but this isn't a technical problem. And technically useful though that technical information is, this is a much deeper and wider problem. So there was a tendency to, in some cases, treat it as a technical problem. There was also a tendency not always to connect the dots and not assess and decide upon a response in a particular country based on the demonstration effect of how you respond in that place versus how it's going to look in other countries in the world. And so there was a strong temptation to make an accommodation in any one country based on the idea we've got various interests there, we'll smooth it out, without thinking through, once you connect the dots, leaders over here, watching what you do there. But I think actually things are getting much better. And in the last year, I'm not just saying that because Ben is here, but in the last year and a half, I feel a sense of momentum picking up, particularly in the U.S. government, a bit less so in some other governments. You see it at USAID, where there was a very useful exercise that was carried out. there to review this issue and to write some guidance for missions on how to understand it and respond to it. We've seen it at the State Department, where there's been some similar exercises. We see it at the White House, coordinating better interagency policy on this, and I think Ben will talk about that. And so we start to see better responses when bad NGO laws are passed, and we see some fairly deft action by different international actors, including the United States, to rise quickly to the challenge when, say, in Kenya, suddenly a bad NGO law comes on the screen. People jump into it and are fairly effective at countering that. We see somewhat more, I think, awareness raising for U.S. officials in the field in different countries, so when an issue hits, they understand that this is part of a larger picture and don't just treat it as a one-off thing. We see moving to the multilateral level an attempt, although it's difficult as we can talk about, to bring in other multilateral fora or multilateral organizations to make sure this is not seen just as a U.S. issue, and there's an attempt to do that in various domains, including, of course, the call to action by President Obama at the margins of the UN General Assembly last September. And we see aid providers trying to figure out how to distance aid from the physical locations where they're sometimes under threat. And in some ways, the democracy aid community, I think, was a little slow over the last 10 years to become smarter about technology generally, but this problem is pushing them to think a lot harder about distance learning or how you operate, how you transmit the kind of ideas and knowledge and advice that they've been trying to from a distance. It's hard. And as we know in the world of online learning, there aren't sort of easy answers from that, but they're starting to get more serious about doing that. Let me finish up by saying the responses are getting better, but it's very, very hard, and it's going to continue to be hard. Here's why, some of the reasons. First, as Jessica alluded to, as I said, this isn't a technical problem with some bad legislatures that just don't understand what a good NGO law is. This is a shift in international politics, away from a period in which there was a sense of growing consensus on certain international political norms and a sense of lowering sovereignty. This is not a technical problem. This is a broader power shift that's occurring. And, many people who are not very interested in the world of democracy promotion often tend to see it as a kind of side issue. Those of us and many in the room who've sort of made it more central to their concerns, it's to some extent the canary in the coal mine of international politics. Is once countries say, we don't want this, they're saying something much deeper, much more than just we don't want your media program or we don't want your NGO training. They're saying your vision of the international liberal order, both in the norms that you're putting forward and in your vision of lowered sovereignty, we don't want either of those things. We have a different vision of the international liberal order. So when we talk about working against this trend, we're talking about, something very big. What will it take, in a simple sense, for President Putin to stop thinking the West is trying to do in Russia? Second reason why it's hard is, as I mentioned, the idea of foreign subversion through these kinds of assistance programs is almost a natural response to the rising wave of protests in the world. As citizens become more and more engaged in questioning their governments, we are going to see a continued tide of protests against governments around the world. And we are going to see a parallel tide of governments trying to explain away that tide by saying this isn't about authentic protest, this is someone. And you see almost every leader faced with citizen protests points the finger. Often it's very vague. Somebody is stirring up this trouble. It certainly isn't coming from within the country. Third, it's going to be hard because it's very difficult to craft the right responses. There's a tendency to think if we can elevate the response of there's a bad NGO law, let's get the Secretary of State or the President to weigh in on this issue. It's a natural tendency. There are times where I take part in such efforts, but then it's not always easy. I was in Egypt recently, and I was talking to some people who'd worked on the NGO law last year, the draft NGO laws, and some Egyptians who'd been associated with the Shura Council. And I said, was it useful when Secretary Kerry raised this directly with President Morsi last spring? And he said, well, I understand why people like you wanted him to do that. But when he said to President Morsi, we really are concerned about your approach on the NGOs and so forth, that confirmed Morsi's view that these NGOs must really be something of great importance to the U.S. government and to their agenda in Egypt, whatever that happens to be. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't do those things, but I'm saying it's very complicated. We're dealing in murky waters here, and simply saying we just need to push harder and yell louder isn't necessarily always the answer. It's also hard because it's hard for ourselves to define the lines and to explain them in a coherent way to people in other countries. For democracy assistance to be vital and to be useful in a place like, say, Belarus, it has to be pretty politically assertive. If you're not being politically assertive, what are you doing there? Why are you there? If you're assertive and you work with, say, opposition parties and somebody is watching in another country and says, oh, I see what your assistance is. You say, well, no, we do that in cases like this. You're a different kind of case. Yeah, right. That sounds good from Washington, but may not make a lot of sense there. And so we say we don't take sides in elections, but what we're doing in one place isn't really taking side in an election. It's helping democratic forces against non-democratic forces. But it looks like taking sides, and it is taking sides in a way. And so we've got a problem on our hands in the sense that our own standards and boundaries aren't always clear to ourselves. How could they be clear to others? Finally, it's hard because divisions exist within the assistance and the policy community more generally. If we had in the room here a group of sort of Northern Europeans, Central Europeans, Americans, international organization people, we turned off the microphones and turned off the cameras and really asked people what they think about this issue or this phenomenon, we'd get a lot of different answers. Some of them would be, you guys over here, pointing to some particular part, are the problem. And if you would stop doing what you're doing, the rest of us would be fine. So don't ask us to join your campaign on this issue because we don't want to be associated with you. There are a lot of divisions. Now, people are polite within this community, don't always say them out loud. But behind closed doors, there's a sense that, you know, this is your problem, not our problem. You're being different things depending on the community that you're with. So all these reasons why it's hard doesn't mean it's impossible and doesn't mean we should give up. But the basic thrust of this report is this is the new normal. This is the new normal for the field of democracy support. You know, we often have metaphors in our mind, and one of the metaphors I've seen in the community is these are rough waters, as though we're kind of a ship in the ocean that's been kind of smooth after 1991, and somehow it's rough now. I don't think that's a good metaphor. I don't know what the right metaphor is, but we have entered into different terrain now. And this is the way it's going to be for a while. And if anything, what came before, the era of kind of lowered concern about sovereignty and less touchiness about political interventionism, that was unusual. This seems a lot more normal, if you will. And so we have to begin to rethink our attitudes, our approaches, our communication, our coordination, and so forth, based on this reality, rather than thinking we're simply adapting to some short-term problems that will sort of somehow come through back into some placid waters where these issues no longer press upon us. Thanks for your attention. Ben, look forward to your comments.
Well, thanks, Tom, for the very good work on the report, building on all the work you've done over the years on this issue. Jessica, thanks for having me here at Carnegie. Jessica didn't mention that she's known me since the Carter administration, and I'm not that old, so that gives you an indication of the extent of our past knowing each other. And thank you all. I know that many of you work on these issues, care a lot about these issues, helped inform Tom's report. Let me just put some observations out about how we look at the issue, how we respond to some of the points that Tom raised in his comments and in his report, and some of the concepts that we are considering in the administration, and that hopefully will provide a good forum for discussion. I should add that this is a really opportune moment for this report to come out and for us to have this type of conversation. President Obama did this event in September, the high-level event on supporting civil society at the UN General Assembly. And the reason he did is precisely because he was concerned by the same trends that inform Tom's report. And we recognized that we needed to think anew about how we're mobilizing our government, other governments, civil society organizations to better combat the closing space and also take advantage of some of the opportunities that we see on civil society around the world. We've done, I think, the continuity piece of support for civil society. We've invested almost $3 billion since we came into government. But we recognize that the old models of providing assistance are incredibly valuable, but not sufficient for the moment that we're in today. We see the same trends that Tom alludes to, which is not just individual countries where we see closing space, but a trend. Countries looking at what other countries are doing to restrict civil society space and applying those lessons within their borders. So you have almost a convergence of tactics in different parts of the world where countries are really operating from the same playbook in terms of how they're restricting space, passing restrictive laws, seeking to delegitimize political organization and civil society. They're doing this in part, though, because of the fact that people are increasingly empowered to challenge governments because of technology, because of, frankly, the ability of civil society in one country to learn from civil society in another country. So in some respects, the globalization of some of these issues around how individuals, activists, and civil society organizations learn from one another are now being confronted by governments that are similarly sharing concepts in terms of how they push back on civil society. I would note that even as we see this concerning trend in terms of closing space, we see the great value, utility, and strength of civil society in lots of different places. Just to point out a few examples, in Ukraine, the government in Kyiv right now, frankly, draws on the fact that there are many people who were involved in a very strong civil society over many years, who developed not just the ability to organize on the Maidan, but the ability to come into the government and, frankly, govern better than some of the people who were in the Yanukovych administration. So the current caretaker government draws on, I think, the civil society that had thrived within Ukraine for many years, in part with the support of different international partners. I went to Burma last summer, met with the government, met with civil society. What was interesting there is, so you could see how civil society can and should be a resource, not just in dealing with issues that are of importance to civil society organizations, but in terms of making a transition possible inside of Burma. For instance, there's not a lot of expertise and experience in drafting legislation to deal with different issues. One of the points I kept making is that civil society should actually be able to be a partner to the government in terms of dealing with some of the huge capacity problems that they have in confronting legislation. If the political will is there, civil society is actually a resource for making Burma's transition, not just democratically, but economically, function effectively. And we see in the Arab world, in Tunisia and Libya, an explosion of civil society that can similarly bring concrete expertise to bear on different issues that are associated with transition, whether it's drafting of constitutions, building of democratic institutions. Civil society is going to play a critical role if these transitions are to succeed. We also see civil society going into different issue spaces. Environment is principle one, for instance, that is going to allow for, I think, a great amount of expertise to be brought to bear in dealing with challenges. So we saw this as a challenge that we were confronting, but also, frankly, we saw the need to invest in the opportunity afforded by civil society. And that was what launched that effort. And the president focused on three objectives. One was, how do we promote laws and policies and practices that are supportive of a better environment for civil society? Second is, how do we coordinate multilateral diplomatic efforts to push back against the restrictions being imposed on civil society? And then third, are there new things that we can be doing, new and innovative ways to use technology, financing, and even logistical support for civil society organizations? And since then, we've been working to try to bring together these different strands into a strategy that can inform what we're doing. And frankly, the time span we're on here is that we expect to be back at the UN General Assembly in September with a set of concrete initiatives that we've developed in these different areas. I do want to just speak to some of Tom's recommendations and how we're seeking to deal with them in terms of the U.S. government's efforts. One was a recommendation to strengthen and spread understanding of the problem and develop essentially a whole-of-government approach to push back on closing space. And that was a galvanizing factor in bringing together this interagency policy committee that Tom and Jessica referenced that I'm working on. And we've been working in that committee to, along with non-governmental partners on really three different areas. One is how do we strengthen the multilateral tools that we have to bring to bear on this issue. The second is how are we developing strategies around different countries, individual countries, because you can look across different regions and see common trends. There are countries where there is contracting space. There's countries where it's kind of a swing state environment. Civil society still has some significant role to play, but they're facing additional pressures, and it can tip in one direction or another. And then there are countries where there's very good success stories. And so how are we learning, just as I mentioned, governments and civil society organizations are learning from one another, how can we learn from what's happening in a country in Southeast Asia and frankly apply some lessons to what we may be doing in sub-Saharan Africa, in a country that's in a similar dynamic. And then the third part of this is, are there new platforms that we need to be thinking about in terms of how we provide support for civil society? And on that issue, Mike McFall, our recent ambassador in Russia, is playing an informal role in advising us, and I know thinks very highly of Tom and his work, and will be helping us to flesh out concepts. The report also highlights the need to look at new aid approaches, including technology as a complement or alternative to traditional donor funding. And this is definitely something that we've been doing. For example, we recently launched a MENA partnership, which is a multilateral effort to enhance the capacity of civil society groups in the Middle East and North Africa. And there the question is, how do we provide access to technology, to polling, to other professional services so civil society organizations can draw on different resources as they're organizing in a very fluid environment. In some cases, in a place like Libya, where they weren't able to operate before, in other cases, in places where there's been a shrinking space for civil society. In Cambodia, we launched a social innovation lab to bring together civil society, social entrepreneurs, technologists, to try to figure out how we can give better tools to civil society organizations, kind of a one-stop shopping, so that we are providing technologies and tools for organizations that they can then apply to specific objectives. So we want to be creative, and we want to find platforms that can meet the needs of civil society in different parts of the world. The other thing that we're doing is trying to find new multilateral initiatives and groupings that can, frankly, get more countries invested in support for civil society goals, and also bring in organizations who haven't had interface with governments. And our principal effort on this has been the Open Government Partnership. And what has been effective about this is it's a much broader multilateral group. It's not just the United States and Europe. We're bringing in countries from Brazil to India to a number of Asian countries to get at this issue of open governance and transparency, which obviously is not purely a civil society value, but has huge impacts on the ability for citizens to be empowered, to have information, to bring concerns to government. And so it's a way to enlist more governmental partners in outcomes that are, frankly, very beneficial to civil society and to citizens who want to be empowered without working purely through the traditional channels of applying pressure on individual governments. And so you want to build new coalitions and find space for some governments to do things that they're comfortable doing that allows you, again, to enlist a new set of partners that is more reflective of the diffusion of power that Jessica spoke about. Because if we're only working with traditional European allies on this set of issues, there's a bit of a ceiling in terms of who you can reach and the type of audiences you can reach, the messages you can deliver. And so OGP, I think we want to see as increasingly a model for the types of groupings of countries that allow emerging democracies to play a role in this space that they're comfortable with. To that end, as I mentioned, we're also thinking are there other multilateral platforms that we can provide so that it's not just a government coming to, a civil society organization coming to the U.S. government or a U.S. government partner for funding. Is there a different type of multilateral platform that can supplement that so that it's not seen as simply support coming from traced back to the United States in particular or a particular European country, but rather more of a consortium model. And so this is something that we are aiming to flesh out over the coming months as a potential additional source of support for civil society. The report also highlights the need to understand the demonstration effects, the copycat actions that we spoke about, and to strengthen the type of NGO law diplomacy that is critically important. To this end, we've launched partnerships to support a legal enabling environment for civil society organizations. But the other thing that we've wrestled with is, do we need some new articulation of norms in this space? And frankly, the fact is we don't, because the norms already exist and they're already available. And what we want to focus our efforts on is not a new discussion of a new set of norms, but frankly, holding people to the norms that they've already signed up to. So for instance, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides a foundational set of values that we need to be holding countries to. So we can work through existing norms to go back and apply pressure in multilateral fora on those countries that are walking away from their commitments. But we've also tried to pursue additional efforts to strengthen partnerships across this space, like the Busan Partnership on Effective Development Cooperation that brings together a set of partners around values like freedom of speech and association and put some resources behind it. So we're trying to look for ways to work through existing multilateral organizations and existing norms that we can reinforce to push back on the trends that we see, and also try to find, again, those broad partnerships that we can forge so that we're working with like-minded countries as well. And there'll be additional opportunities to connect this in the development space, for instance, as we look at that, look towards the post-2014 development agenda, given the role that civil society plays in advancing development goals around the world. And we're also working, as the report calls for, strengthening the UN framework and the role of regional organizations. On the UN side, we continue to work with partners like the Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of assembly, and work with the Human Rights Council to try to elevate issues associated with civil society. But the other thing that we're trying to do is go to regional organizations, where frankly there has not been a lot of enthusiasm for this set of issues in the past. But if you look at groups like the African Union, like ECOWAS, like the Organization of American States, and like ASEAN, they've actually gotten better at speaking out on some issues related to democracy. For instance, on the need for democratic transitions of power in different regions. We need to broaden that discussion, so it's not just whether a regional organization speaks out on behalf of a democratic result in an election, but that they're drilling down and speaking out for positive movement in terms of the norms of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. That would be a significant change for some of these organizations, but given the investment we've made in regional organizations generally, I think we have to broaden the discussion around democracy from, again, just elections to some of these more core values that affect the ability of civil society to operate. We're also, again, going to continue to work with traditional partners like the Community of Democracies that has done a lot over the years, of course, and to highlight these issues, has been a key partner in places like Kenya to speak out against some of the more disturbing trends that we've seen and provide positive models and reinforcement for the types of actions that would allow for civil society to operate. So this gets at, I think, some of the tools that are out there in international organizations, regional institutions, some of the like-minded groupings that we're seeking to invest in. But I just want to also highlight a number of other initiatives that I think are really important in terms of how we broaden this discussion. Because as Tom says, in some respects, this new normal is not going away. You know, we had an opening of space after the Cold War in which sovereignty was less of an impediment to the support for civil society. And as we look at the long game, we in the United States government need to think about how we are building relationships, again, not just with governments, but with peoples around the world. And that ultimately will, I think, redound to the benefit of civil society. So just to give you some examples of how we think about this, we have a program in Africa that we've launched called the Young African Leaders Initiative. And what this is an initiative that identifies young people in every country in Africa who essentially can partner with the United States government. And at the core of it is a traditional exchange program, a fellowship where they could come to the United States, receive training, go back, and be connected to opportunities in civil society or in governance or in entrepreneurship. But we've also sought to broaden it so that the U.S. government, through its posts around the world, can help provide skills training and can help provide support for young people. And the president did a town hall on this when he was in South Africa. But the fact of the matter is that if we are able to build a network across Africa that it will allow us to empower young people, ultimately, those are relationships that are going to be critically important to us, but those are going to be the people who are going to be fighting these battles in the future. And so if we are able to empower young people across sub-Saharan Africa, that's going to pay a dividend in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years in terms of how these issues are addressed. We're seeking to build a similar program in Southeast Asia, a young leaders program in Southeast Asia, and the president will launch that effort when he travels to the region in April. So again, a new way of thinking about networking with young people, empowering them, connecting them to one another. That's going to end up, I think, impacting very much this space 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So we're thinking about a longer game, even as we're dealing with the challenges we're facing right now. Entrepreneurship is an issue that we've invested a lot in. We've built a process of global entrepreneurship summits. We've established mentoring relationships around the world. Now, this doesn't seem like a traditional civil society issue, but what we've found is that if you promote the value of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs are not just likely to create economic growth, but they are innovators. They are people who will want their government to be less corrupt. They are people who will want to be more connected to people in other countries. And ultimately, if we are bringing resources to bear, if we are networking entrepreneurs in countries around the world, that, I think, is going to create a momentum for reform and a momentum for a space that is more innovative and more conducive to the operation of civil society. We are similarly seeking to build networks with religious leaders around the world. And I know, again, this can seem ancillary to this closing space of civil society, but if you are able to build a dialogue with a religious leader in many countries, that ultimately is going to get you to the public faster than, frankly, working through the government or working through a traditional partner. The point is that the U.S. government needs to think far more broadly about how it engages foreign governments and foreign publics in the 21st century. And that in doing so, we can strengthen the norms that we care about. And we can empower people, again, to hold us accountable and hold their own governments accountable going forward. And it's not with a political objective in mind. It's with the objective that if people are more entrepreneurial, ultimately they're going to make better decisions about how to promote economic growth and opportunity in their own countries. If young people have better skills training, they too will be better capable of organizing. And then the last piece I'd mention on this is technology. We've invested a lot in trying to get people connected to the internet, to social media, in ways that empower them to access information. And ultimately, that type of effort will allow them to organize, allow them to create virtual space where civil society can thrive. So all that is to say that we want to work very hard on the traditional methods of support for civil society and push back on closing space for civil society. We want to work through existing organizations, regional and multilateral, to strengthen the norms that people are signed up to and to try to broaden the discussion around how we're supporting civil society. But we also want to look for how are we forging the partnerships that are going to pay dividends 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, whether you're talking about an entrepreneur, a young person who's going to found their own civil society organization, a religious leader who may be suspicious of these types of efforts, but over time, through engagement, can learn to see the benefit that can come to their community through interactions with people who come from different places and have different ideas. All of these things, I think, are meant to push back on the closing of space we see right now, but also to enlarge this space over time. And I'll just close by saying a few words about the trade-offs. This is always the issue that comes up. How does the United States trade off its interests in stability or in a partnership in one country with its interest in civil society. And here, too, I think, look, there's a traditional set of values that we need to be held accountable for, that we need to make sure that we're not putting in the back seat, raising these concerns. But to Tom's point, what we have to wrestle with is when do we make it harder for civil society instead of making it easier? And this gets at the notion of, can we find ways that civil society organizations inside of countries can look for support from the United States, but also look for support elsewhere, from multilateral forums, from non-traditional sources of support and funding, so that the United States is not always in the middle of the discussion and is not always the issue. And can we also be investing in people through our assistance programs and in ways, again, that empower them, but do not play into the direct narrative that is often exploited by other governments. So some of this will have to be traditional pushback, but some of this will have to be making use of different tools, different organizations, different associations, so that people can find support to organize, and that it's not simply a bilateral issue between the United States and another country, but rather it's a question of whether that country is isolating itself by not living up to a norm, or that country is losing the ability to have investment and have the type of growth that they need to see. We need to, again, make it an environment such that there's a cost over time for countries if they are restricting space, not just in terms of their bilateral relationship with us, but in terms of how their own people hold them accountable and how they're situated regionally and in the international community. So that's not easy, and we don't have all these answers yet, and we very much look forward to reviewing Tom's findings, but also hearing from you today and in the days to come. But I can tell you that when President Obama sat down with us to look at his second-term priorities, this was an issue that he went to right away. Again, both because he saw the problem, but also because he saw that if we're going to deal with a lot of the broader challenges that we face, governments aren't going to have all the answers to deal with climate change, to deal with conflict resolution. And so we actually need civil society, not just to promote the type of political environment that we seek in countries and the types of traditional human rights that we stand for around the world, but also we're going to need civil society to solve problems. And so that's what's guided the prioritization of this issue, and look forward to discussing it more today. Thanks.
Given the time, I think we will skip a conversation among the three of us and turn directly to all of you. There are microphones, and so please do wait for one. Please introduce yourself. Please be brief. In the back.
Hi, Jennifer Windsor, Georgetown University. Thank you, Tom and Sasha and Carnegie, for an excellent report. And thank you, Ben, for your very encouraging comments about the interest that the Obama administration is taking on this. I'd like to push back a little bit on two issues to get into a little bit more detail. Two concepts that I think have been particularly troublesome for civil society. And one is transparency. You mentioned the Open Government Initiative, but the negatives associated with that, in which governments get information about who is being assisted in their country and what the negative impact on that, on the civil society groups that are receiving assistance could be. And two, terrorism. And Tom points this out, and I still feel like there has not been any political will, either within any administration or members of Congress, to really look at how counterterrorism legislation has affected this. And I think Ethiopia is an excellent example of that. So if you could address those 2 points. Thank you.
Can I ask you to take notes and let me collect a couple of questions, because I think there are several, and so we have time to get everything on the table. Go ahead.
Callie Curry from the Project 2049 Institute. Tom, you mentioned that the issue of China having never been appreciative of our efforts to promote civil society there, but the situation has gotten worse during the course of this administration. And I'm just curious as to the thoughts about the specific case of China, as it seems to be one of the bigger existential threats to the norms that have been referenced today and the whole idea of democracy as the end goal for political transitions in various countries around the world.
Okay, yes.
Hi, Lisa Davis with Freedom House. I'm very excited that the second term initiative has reached the presidential level for supporting this and pushing back on closing space. But in the first term, Secretary Clinton supported and rolled out the Lifeline, the Enabling Civil Society program, the Embattled Civil Society program. And that involved a consortium of a number of our groups, Freedom House, ICNL, Civicus, Frontline Defenders. And it involved over 14 countries and 2 foundations supporting that multilateral approach. How is the new initiative different or complementary to Lifeline?
Okay. Who would like to begin? Tom, do you want to start?
I'll take the easy ones, and then Ben can take the
Okay,
others.
fair enough.
Jennifer, I agree transparency is really tough. You know, there is a debate in the assistance community. Some people, when they think and talk about this problem, say, well, the answer is we need to come forward with more information about what we're doing. And it's the lack of information in some cases that provokes suspicions or raises suspicions. And then other people argue back and say, I don't think that's the case. I think actually the governments that really care in a negative way about this assistance have ways of finding out what we're doing and are quite well informed about it. And in any case, we're actually fairly transparent about most of it. And that it isn't a lack of information that's making them so suspicious, and more information isn't likely to do that. Moreover, the second side says more transparency may put people in vulnerable positions. We are doing work, you know, with groups that are targeted, and sometimes making it known exactly what kind of aid they're getting from whom can be dangerous to them. I think I'm more in the latter group, and I'm all for aid transparency and do think it's an important thing, but I don't think in this realm it's per se the answer or much part of an answer. But I'd be happy to hear other points of view on that. With respect to China, I would just say you're absolutely right. I mean, I was just highlighting that China, you know, as you said, is never like this. It did, starting in 2004, 5, and 6, in the initial wave of pushback, start to move down a more negative road with respect to international role in civil society development or other political elements of Chinese life, and it hasn't really gotten any better since then. China is less, I would say, outspoken, or one might use the word aggressive, than some other foreign governments about talking openly about how bad this is and trying to convince neighbors not to do it. In a sense, they regard it sort of more as a Chinese issue or a Chinese problem, whereas there's some other leaders, like Hugo Chavez was for a while, and I would say President Putin obviously falls in that category, who like to make it more of a cause célèbre. So in that sense, China is very much an issue and very close to this. And unfortunately, as we know, the new leadership is concentrating on economic reforms and unfortunately sees a natural trade-off with political openness right now and has sort of rebalanced the two in a not good way. But it's not, in a sense, a leader in the international system against this work in a kind of contagion way, I would say.
Well, let me just address all the questions. You know, on transparency, it's a difficult issue. We, as a general matter, obviously are mandated a degree of transparency in what we do, and I think what we've sought to do through OGP and some other multilateral forums is use transparency as a value to empower citizens. And also, though, to create new space again for partnership with different organizations. In part because OGP, I think, started from a place of a desire to combat corruption by governance, and so the concept being that, you know, if you're providing more transparent modes of governance, if that allows for citizens to have more information, to make decisions, to organize, and to hold people accountable. However, when you get into transparency around civil society funding sources and other means, we totally understand and have dealt with the fact that that does put people at risk. And so part of what we want to do through this initiative and other efforts is disaggregate, okay, there's a certain amount of risk that we have to live with in terms of, we're a transparent society. People can kind of follow the money, see where support from the U.S. government is coming from. But again, are there ways to take this out of the U.S. government in some cases and make this a more either a multilateral or a consortium type approach, like you mentioned on the Lifeline, such that it's not always the U.S. government that is the address for this funding, but that there are other sources for civil society organizations to draw support from one another, to draw support for other types of consortium or multilateral efforts that have a different type of legitimacy. Again, without at all compromising our own funding, which we want to continue, are there ways to create some distance for those organizations who feel like they're being more endangered if they are, directly pulling from an address that comes back to Washington or to ex-European capital? That doesn't solve the problem entirely, but it does give people different destinations to turn to for support, and that's where we'd like to end up as one of the principal objectives of this type of initiative, the multilateral platform or the consortium platform that we're seeking to enhance. On terrorism, you're obviously right that this is a perennial problem. Some of this is just going to have to be constant pushback on countries that pass overly broad terrorism laws, counterterrorism laws. But part of this also has to be, frankly, us more effectively making the case over time that the permission of civil society creates a counterbalance and a space for people other than terrorist organizations. If you look in Yemen, for instance, we've tried to bring civil society into the national dialogue there. There has to be an outlet somewhere other than AQAP for someone who wants their voice to be heard through something other than the government's official political party. If you look at Somalia, as you're seeking to create some type of democratic culture that can support a government that is seeking to expand its writ, again, people in Somalia need to have places to go to make their voices heard, to organize, again, that are alternatives to a piracy organization or to al-Shabaab. If you look at Libya, where you have a lot of people who are organized and who are in armed groups, ultimately you want an outlet that channels that more into civil society organization. And there has been an explosion of different groups from the east to the west. So I think in addition to trying to push back on the more restrictive laws, we need to be making an affirmative case to these countries and these governments, whether they're more entrenched governments or whether they're places in transition, that providing that type of outlet and enabling some degree of political organization or civil society organization is a long-term solution here. And so that as we approach these countries, particularly these transition countries, that's something that we want to focus on. On China, I agree certainly that it's among the most challenging environments. I mean, one promising potential avenue is the fact that, again, you see very restrictive space on people organizing around certain political rights. But you do see people organizing around environmental activism, for instance, where China has huge problems and the government acknowledges that they have huge problems. And is there a way to enable an environment where there's more ability for people to organize around an issue that, again, at least gives some space? And I think one of the ways to look at that is through these issues that are increasingly of concern politically inside of China, but they're not necessarily in the area where the government comes down with the hardest possible fist. Similarly, we've sought over time to initiate dialogues around issues related to the rule of law, that can hopefully converge the growing interest in anti-corruption, given the threat that the government sees from the public's attitude about corruption. Is there an opening there for some type of dialogue? But I obviously agree with you that it does present a huge challenge. On the Lifeline issue, look, there are many different models that have been launched and efforts that have been launched that get at the concept of a consortium and bringing together like-minded partners. I think part of what we want to do through this initiative is really land on what is the best model that we might try to build to scale. and to a bigger scale. And so, again, not to substitute for other things that we do, but again, can we take something that we see working, bring the broadest possible group of partners together, and build it to a larger scale? And that's exactly the exercise we're doing. And we can draw on the example of the Lifeline and other types of partnerships that we've developed over the last several years. Because, often in this space you'll find there are lots of small or medium-sized initiatives taking place in different parts of the world. We want to make sure that there's kind of a best practices informing all that, but that there's also potentially something tangible at the center of that that can be built out over time.
Let me take one more set of questions, and I'll go this end first, and we'll take. And then we'll go here.
Hi, I'm Amy Hawthorne at the Atlantic Council. I wanted to ask about the really difficult case of Egypt. Many people believe that the U.S. government had a very weak response to the whole NGO trial and conviction, and indeed the negative fallouts of this episode continue to be felt in Egypt. I just got back from there last night. The reverberations are still happening, and indeed throughout the region. On the other hand, the U.S. did face two really significant challenges in figuring out how to respond to Egypt, I think. The first is our geostrategic interest that we have in that country and the perception that the cost of pushing back hard on this issue might have been too high. And also the really difficult issue, which you both kind of touched on, which is that there's not a strong constituency, a vocal constituency in Egypt for our democracy assistance. There are very few voices in Egypt that spoke out in defense of the people who were on trial and convicted. What lessons did the U.S. government learn from the Egypt episode, or what lessons should we draw from it? Thank you.
Okay. Take one right here. And in the back.
İlhan Tanrı from Turkish Press. And another difficult matter is Turkey. It is a Muslim and democratic ally of yours. And according to paper just came out 2 days ago from Carnegie, Ambassador Mark Pierini is basically summarizing that a country who has been building its institution for about a decade destroyed almost everything in the last few weeks. And when we look at the U.S. administration and its handling for the last 2 months, it is really hard to understand what exactly or how exactly you are getting your messages across, because NGOs and Turkish opposition actors are kind of surprised or unaware how even the U.S. is taking position, because, again, the public statements for the last few years, but also last few weeks, very much muted and hard to understand what kind of position is taking. Thank you.
Okay, and last one back there.
Thank you. Radwan Masmoudi with Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. I want to ask you about our support for democracy in the Arab world. After the Arab Spring, which started 3 years ago, one would have thought that the United States would really jump on this opportunity to support democracy in the Arab world. But in fact, we saw our support diminish over the last 3 years. Let me just mention 2 examples. In Egypt, we had a coup d'etat, a military coup, a bloody and brutal coup. And we're still discussing here whether it was a coup or not. And this is really hurting the image and the credibility of the United States all over the Arab world. It's clearly a coup by any definition, and the whole world is calling it a coup, and yet we are still discussing this. In the case of Tunisia, we have a success story that also I would have expected, and I would have thought that the United States would have jumped at this opportunity to really support Tunisia and to make it a successful model for the rest of the Arab world. Yet our support to Tunisia also is diminishing. Just as an example, 2012, the United States gave about $300 million support to Tunisia. Last year it was $13 million, 1/10 of what it was in 2012. The economy in Tunisia is...
Why don't we save the time for
Okay, very good. So those are my two questions. Yeah.
All right. I think we've got three here, but if there's one more last urgent question, we'll take it.
Lalit Masfin, Gimboat 7, Movement for Democracy in Ethiopia. Why isn't, if there is a poster child for bad governance in sub-Saharan Africa, it is Ethiopia? And why is the Obama administration not holding Ethiopia accountable? It's sending it $1 billion a year. It has the most draconian, it has passed the most draconian anti-CSO law, anti-terrorism law. It's imprisoning journalists, all kinds of political dissidents. I myself am here because I can't go back home. And yet, you know, you're talking about copycat laws. Of course, Kenya is going to do the same CSO kind of law because there was nothing happened to Ethiopia. Nothing happened to Mallas. In fact, when Susan Rice was in Ethiopia in 2012, when Mallas died, she was eulogizing him as if she was talking about, you know, Mother Teresa. So this, I mean, incredible hypocrisy in U.S. policy really is hurting American interests in the long term. Short term, yes. These are unelected regimes. There are 545. This tribal regime in Ethiopia that's governing, it has 545 seats out of 547. And the Obama administration didn't say anything in the 2010 election. I give him, you know, he's courageous for coming out and speaking about Uganda's anti-gay law. But what about, you know, when people are imprisoned? I mean, he never spoke about it. I don't know if you wrote or he wrote the speech that he gave in Accra. It was wonderful. It was the most, you know, wonderful speech. Africa doesn't need strong men, it needs strong institutions, yes. But when you send $1 billion to support that same strong man, how is a strong institution going to be built?
Okay, hard choices. Ben.
Where to start? Look, let me just start with the Arab world because it then kind of leads into some of these other issues. You know, I often say to friends who visit from the Arab world that we are constantly confronted with an impossible dynamic in which the United States is criticized for meddling in the affairs of countries, but then also asked to meddle in the affairs of countries. And so that's, you know, we face a very tricky balance. In terms of how I think, you know, we would look at this, you know, first of all, I think we need to be deeply invested in the success of transitions, because ultimately what's really going to matter is if there can begin to be success stories on the other end of the Arab awakening. You mentioned Tunisia. We are actually deeply engaged in Tunisia. We're going to have the Prime Minister here next month. I think you should expect that, you know, we'll be providing additional assistance to Tunisia. And so we've aimed to be responsive economically on security issues to help that transition succeed. So I'd expect that, you know, we are not at the end of our assistance story in terms of trying to invest in Tunisia's transition. And I recently met with the leader of the Nada Party, you know, who, you know, they made a tough decision to step out of government to enable transition to a new government, to enable constitution to contest an election. Again, I think that the message was very clear, which is that the U.S. should be deeply engaged, but we shouldn't necessarily, you know, make it our success. I mean, the success has to be the Tunisian people's success. So sometimes, you know, when we are too heavy-handed, too much kind of taking credit for something, or too much, you know, this is about American values succeeding in Tunisia, that ultimately can undermine the hard choices that political leaders need to make in a country. But I think as you look at Tunisia, as you look at Libya, as you look at Yemen, we are very focused on trying to support people who are making tough decisions and trying to come out on the other end of a successful transition. So one element of our strategy there has to be working in a very steady, sustained, and sometimes quiet way to provide technical assistance, to provide economic support, to start to connect some of these countries to the grid of the global economy, frankly, some of them do need security assistance. And sometimes people who were once activists get in government, in a place like Libya, and they see, well, wait a second, the best thing the United States could do for us is help build a security force. So it's using all those different tools to try to create a successful model. Egypt, and by the way, I might add, what's interesting is you have, as someone, we turn over, I've been here 5 years, which seems like forever for me, but isn't that long in the grand span of things. The less long and deep the U.S. relationship in the country, the easier it is sometimes to forge that relationship. So Libya and Tunisia, we have a lot less baggage than we do in other places. And so in some respects, that's made it an easier discussion, which leads me to Egypt. I think to take both questions, I mean, first of all, looking back on that circumstance in 2011, part of what I think we saw was that there was a pretty broad agreement in Egypt that they wanted change, that they wanted a new regime. There wasn't broad agreement at all about what should take its place. And so after Mubarak left power, you had a very complex set of circumstances where different groups are essentially beginning to compete for who's going to govern next. In that environment, the easiest thing to do as a unifying factor was to mobilize against the United States. And what I think we would have done differently perhaps is we allowed ourselves to become the issue way too quickly. And it became about us and not about what the people of Egypt needed to do to organize for an election and to have a successful transition. It's hard to say exactly how we could have avoided that circumstance. But I do think part of it is that we didn't have alternative ways of supporting civil society and enabling political space to develop in Egypt, so that it immediately became, oh, this is the United States activating its tools to control Egypt and its future. And again, by allowing us to become the issue, it became, we become a scapegoat for all kinds of other things that need to be done in Egypt. So I think in that circumstance, we didn't have options, frankly, for how are we providing support that enables people to adjust to a new reality in Egypt of political organization. And, we constantly wrestle with this. Are there different ways we can provide assistance to reach people directly that aren't as stigmatized and easily caricatured? So, I think, it was a case in point for how we need to have other modes of support that allow people to access resources without it just being about, oh, this is the United States getting in our business. In terms of where we are today, in terms of where we are with this government, look, there are lots of different trade-offs we have to make. Some of the trade-offs are, the traditional ones that people point to. You have a geostrategic interest versus a values interest. I actually think another trade-off is, do we more effectively promote over time the values we care about by completely disengaging and saying, you know what, we object to what happened, so we're done here. We're taking all of our assistance and pulling out. Or do we need to remain engaged to a certain extent such that we can keep making the argument and keep pressing the case? And that's the balance that we've tried to strike in Egypt, which is we've sought to have there be consequences for what took place, for the violence that took place, for the repressive actions that we saw take place. And there have been cancellations and suspensions and postponements of certain types of assistance. At the same time, we said we have an interest in the people of Egypt, we have an interest in the success of Egypt, and we have real security interests with the government of Egypt, such that we want to maintain this relationship. And if Egypt can follow a path that restores an elected democratic government and starts to respect the rights of people, then we can broaden out from that foundation in terms of our relationship. And so in this instance, the trade-off is we believed it was better to remain invested in a relationship with the government and people of Egypt than to essentially say that relationship is going to come to an end because of events that transpired. So again, in the broader Arab world, I think these are the types of decisions we're making. You know, how do we empower success stories? How do we work in very complex circumstances with countries that we have partnerships with that we don't necessarily agree with on these issues? And I think that's something we wrestle with on a regular basis. At the same time, as I was saying, how do we also broaden the aperture here so that we're engaging more people than just the governments? You know, through outreach to young people, entrepreneurs, exchanges, virtual exchanges, things that don't necessarily seem like immediate efforts in this space, but over time will pay dividends. And I remember being struck when the initial protests happened in Egypt and Tahrir Square. We didn't, you know, we knew some of who those folks were through fairly non-traditional means. They were people who participated in our entrepreneurship program, or they participated in our science and technological exchanges. You know, so sometimes, again, you never know where you're going to meet and empower the future leaders of places. And so we have to constantly be pushing ourselves to not just settle for knowing a very small number of elites in a certain country, but to be broadening the circle of people we're engaging with. On Turkey, it's obviously been a very challenging number of months. I mean, I can tell you that we do press on these issues of freedom of association, of respect for the rule of law, of respect for independent media. It's part of our regular dialogue with the government. You know, here too, we've had to push back on a lot of misinformation. You know, our ambassador fomenting events, the U.S. being associated with, you know, somebody in Pennsylvania who, you know, is well beyond our control or influence. And so I think we sought that balance of, you know, how are we communicating regularly with the government to raise concerns about issues that we see, again, while not playing into a narrative that is untrue and calling out that the inaccuracy of that narrative when we can. But ultimately, you know, this is something that people of Turkey are going to have to resolve in elections and through their institutions. But I think the U.S. and Europe are pretty clear on the types of principles that are important to the long-term relationship with Turkey, and that provides its own incentive to work those issues through democratically. And then Ethiopia, you know, we have been concerned by the laws that have been passed, and I think, look, you're right to hold us to account. We have to ask ourselves questions, hard questions about you know, the fact that we have a relationship that is important for a lot of U.S. interests, but also we see undemocratic practices. It's hard, in particular in places like Ethiopia, where they're not just security interests. There's a lot of cooperation on development, and so you start to get into questions of, you know, yet another trade-off is when you start to restrict assistance that has a value in terms of development and human needs. But I take your point that the security relationship is one that we've been significantly invested in part because it gets at, you know, regional questions, you know, Somalia and other issues. So there, it's a trade-off, and if we aren't getting the trade-off right, you should hold us accountable for it. And we should do better at making sure that we're pressing on these other issues. And I would say we've seen this trend accelerate, and so I think, you know, we've been seeking to calibrate our response. We are very focused on this issue that you mentioned, which is also how do you prevent this from becoming duplicated in other countries. And that's one of these issues that we're looking at, which is that how do we contain and prevent the spread of these types of laws or practices to other countries. And so in our engagement with Kenya and our engagement with other countries, that's certainly something we're focused on. But it is right now in the world, perhaps one of the best examples of a place where the United States has to look very hard at the type of trade-offs that we make.
Just one closing thought.
Yeah,
it's late, and thank you, Ben, so much for coming and for staying. One closing thought, just in the nature of a broader perspective. As you know, there's a strong tendency in Washington when there's a problem to say we should either do more or we should do less. That's kind of the way debates go in Washington. And the democracy community is facing a problem here, and some people think, well, we should just back away, do less. Other people say, no, lean in, do more. Both of those are the wrong answer. We have to be smarter, to do it better, to communicate better, we have to coordinate better, we have to be better partners with other people, we have to find new methods, we have to be innovative, etc. None of the things we have to do are any different than the things we should have already been thinking about this field as it moves from its first big generation of the 90s and the 00s to the new field. This problem, though, is forcing us to face them sooner and with a greater sense of urgency. But none of the things that we're trying to do or we need to do are any different than what smart support for democracy and rights would be in any case. So it isn't more, it isn't less, it's different, smarter, better. And I hope that's, and I appreciate the nature of your remarks is, I think, very much in that spirit. The long game, trying to find different approaches, partnership, coordination, communication. So, as I said, it's not a solution, it's an approach, and that's what we need. Thank you.
I think the scope of Ben's remarks and of your questions suggests that, or underline that Tom has once again found a sort of a crucial focus for our thinking about this whole field. I would just say, in addition to my thanks to Ben for coming and for the depth of his remarks, the other thing, in addition to being smarter, is being patient. I mean, one thing that Washington isn't always terrific at is knowing when to judge the success or failure of a policy. And clearly, we're in medias res here. And there will be some of these stories that look very different in a few years' time. But with that, I'm sorry for having gone over.
You remind me of one thing, which is because I'm going to head back to deal with Ukraine. And, we could have, Yanukovych did a lot of things that were undemocratic. And we could have kind of pulled up stakes in Ukraine. But the fact that we maintain relations there has been of great value the last few months. Because we knew people in the government, we knew people in the opposition, we had security cooperation. So staying engaged over time, you don't know when the opportunity is going to emerge, just like you don't know when the challenge is going to emerge. So your patience comment reminded me of that.
Exactly. Anyway, please join me in thanking both our speakers.